My name is Mindy Hannick. I'm your moderator today, and I coordinate for the community and school gardens. My job is to enable other folks to be able to grow, so I am not as well versed as Arnie and Bill when it comes to the veggie crops. So I'm really excited that they're here to share their knowledge. So today we're going to be talking about some of Bill and Arnie's favorite crops. We're going to talk about sweet potato, Seminal pumpkin, peanut, cherry tomato, cucumber, eggplant, watermelon. There's other choices that you might want to consider planting for the summer. Those are okra, cowpeas, hot peppers, lima beans, and Malabar spinach, and Everglades tomato. But we're mainly going to be talking about those that are listed there in the bigger font, and we're going to tackle them in the reverse. So we're actually going to be starting with Arnie, and Arnie's going to get us off to a great start talking a little bit about the different seasons that we have here in Florida. We're very fortunate we have so many seasons, and a little bit about how to launch yourself into successfully planting for summer.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Before we dive into the actual summer vegetables, I wanted to take one step back because some of you may have gardens now. Some of you may opt not to plant in the summer and be looking toward fall planting. And even those of you that plant in the summer, you want to kind of plan for your fall planting now when you plant your summer garden, so you can just roll into it. So this first chart is really just to give you a feel for how the gardening 12 months a year goes on here in Florida. And the most important thing you want to take away from this chart before I go into some details, when planting vegetables, it's timing, timing, timing. If you plant a vegetable out of its season that it likes, it's going to struggle, it's not going to do good. So it's very important, whether you're planting in the summer, the fall, the winter, the spring, that you choose varieties that are really optimized for the growing seasons we have down here. So on the first row of the chart, I'm going to jump ahead to the end of the summer. Even though we're going to be talking about summer vegetables, anything you plant now, you want to think about, well, do I have to pull it out in the fall? Can I keep it growing? For example, and I'm going to be covering eggplants, going to be one of my favorites because you can grow eggplants 12 months a year down here. So if you plant an eggplant now, you wouldn't want to pull it out in the fall. It'll keep on growing and producing eggplants, and it'll like the fall weather even better. So there are varieties that are transitional. A lot of the ones we'll be talking about can be grown, you know, a month or two before today even, and they'll just go right through the summer. And there are some that really do great in the summer. So you want to factor in, you know, if you want to really garden seriously and get produce all the time, you want to think about what you're going to be doing in the next season. So for the fall for us really begins in August, when very few people are thinking about planting anything that's hot. We got to worry about hurricanes and the heavy rains. But the middle to the end of August is when you would start planting what we call warm weather crops. And we really categorize our vegetables into two categories: cool weather crops and warm weather crops. And if you jump down to just below the chart, most of the classifications have to do with nighttime temperatures. Our cool weather crops really like cooler temperatures. 40 to 60 degrees, average temperatures at night are fine for them. They tolerate frost. We don't get many frosts down here, but we do get them. And there's nothing more frustrating than you've just planted a tomato plant and it's growing for about 2 months, and then you get a frost in the middle of December, and then you have to pull it out. So the cool weather crops will be fine in a frost. We once in a while get a freeze down here. They'll probably even survive that. So examples would be peas, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, lettuce, cauliflower, carrots. None of these will grow well in the summer. So right away you would take them off your list for summer gardening. Now, and again, getting back to the chart, when we get to the warm weather crops, which is the second row of vegetables I list there, they prefer nighttime temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees. And we're kind of getting out of that range now. I was at the garden this morning, it was 68 degrees this morning. And we're in another 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to be steadily in the mid 70s. So a lot of the warm weather crops are going to start to look kind of, pale, and they'll start to not do so well. Tomato is one of those transitional crops. I'm going to be talking about it. It's not the easiest crop to grow, but there are a few varieties that will grow through the summer. Most won't. Peppers, same deal with them. I won't be talking about them, but there are a few varieties that will go on through the summer. Eggplant, as I said, it's a 12-month-a-year crop as long as it doesn't get hit by frost. Most beans won't grow in the summer. Most squash won't do well. Bill's going to cover one that does great. Cucumbers are another transitional crop. One melon that I'll be talking about, a watermelon, really does well in the summer and also in the fall and the spring. One of the main reasons tomatoes don't do well is they won't pollinate. You may get flowers, they'll fall off. They really like a temperature between 50 and 70 degrees. But the University of Florida has done some breeding, and there are some tomatoes you can grow if you really like tomatoes. And the summer crops, and I'll get back to the chart, they really like it hot. That's really the name of the course. Nighttime temperatures in the mid to upper 70s, daytime temperatures in the mid 90s, and a lot of these things just thrive in this environment. Okra, sweet potatoes, which Bill will cover, watermelon, which I'll cover, hot peppers, southern peas. Okay, so if we go back up to that chart, and if we look at the second row, and again, we won't be spending any time on this, once we start getting into the mid-October to the end of October, we start to get cooler nighttime temperatures. And we have a very long season for growing cool weather crops. It's 4 or 5 months, which is better than most of the country for growing these crops. So even when you're planting your fall crops, you got to start to be thinking about toward the end of fall and rotating into some of the cooler weather crops. And then when we get to February, again, you rotate back into the warm weather crops. And then, of course, then we get to the summer. And the begin and end planting are really important dates because, again, we talked about timing when I first started on this chart. Once you get beyond the end of this month, a lot of the crops that you're going to be planting for the summer may not give you anything until you get to the early fall. And by then you may be wanting to plant other crops in their place. So you have to make a decision. So the last piece of advice I'll give you before we get to the next chart is that if you want to plant some of these summer vegetables, you should get them in the ground in the next couple of weeks. Ideally, a month ago would have been even better for a lot of these crops, just to get the head start and you get more produce out of them. Some of them it doesn't matter. Like I said, the biggest problem might be if you want to do a fall crop and you're still waiting, for example, your sweet potatoes to give you potatoes, you may be trying to decide, well, do I pull out the sweet potatoes and plant something else? So you'd like to get something you can eat off these crops. Okay, could you, next chart, Minnie? Okay, again, just some basics about for people that haven't gardened a lot or haven't gardened in Florida. We have 3 soil types, all right? And this is throughout the United States, throughout the world. And they have 3 types of components. Sand, which is what we have here in Sarasota County. Closer you get to the ocean, the more the sand. Silt, which is really nice if you can find it. You might find it in a riverbed. and clay, which if you're a Midwestern or a Northern gardener, you know all about clay. Even in Central Florida, you'll see the soil texture change from sand to silt to clay. Most vegetables won't grow in pure sand. A lot of our shrubs do. We have to amend the soil. The most common amendment we can use is compost, some kind of organic material. You can get compost at the county landfill for free if you want to drive over there with a garbage pail. You can buy it in the stores. It's expensive, but you really need to amend the soil if you want to be successful. Everything else you do will not yield the results you will get by really having an organically rich soil, especially in this part of Florida. The other thing about amendments, most of them are not high in nutritional value, very high in organic matter, favorable bacteria for the plants. They lighten the soil. They do a lot of good things for the soil, but most of them have about 1% of the key elements that we would want a plant to have, which would be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In this part of Florida, we have a lot of phosphorus. We normally, most of our fertilizers that are designed for Florida don't even include little or no phosphorus, because our soils happen to be very rich in phosphorus because of all the limestone deposits we have here. The other thing, well, so you want to amend the soil with at least 3 or 4% of nitrogen and potassium. Maybe your soil already has a good supply of that if you've been gardening for a while. But if you're gardening for the first time, or your plants have been looking anemic for a long time, a lot of yellowing, it could be a nutritional deficiency. You don't want to over-fertilize. You never want to over-fertilize and stimulate the plant. So this is something only you're going to know about your own micro environment that you're planting in, whether it's in a community garden or a garden at home. The other thing that normally is in soil and we normally don't have to add is something we call micronutrients. They're a bunch of chemicals, okay, minerals, and some of them, you know, we need also. Manganese, magnesium, calcium, iron. These are all things that if a plant has not enough of these, you will get a nutritional deficiency. It could be a condition called chlorosis, where you may see yellowing of leaves with green veins, and all colors of the rainbow type of nutritional deficiencies can occur. So again, if you're gardening for the first time, or if you're not sure, or if you've had problems in the past, you might want to consider either buying a general purpose fertilizer that has these in it and just read the label, or you can add these as supplementals. So soil preparation is probably the most important thing you can do to help your vegetables. If you give them a good, rich soil with a good amount of fertilizer, you're 2/3 of the way there, assuming they have enough sunlight. And for vegetables, at least 6 hours a day for just about all vegetables. Mulching is very important all year round. There's a lot of benefits from mulching. Probably the biggest benefit is that you conserve water. Water is a precious commodity down here. About 75% of the water that you put into your soil, if you don't mulch, will come back out of the soil through evaporation. Maybe less of a problem in the summer if we get heavy rain every day, so watering becomes less of an issue. But in the summer especially, you'd like to regulate that soil temperature. You probably don't want it getting really hot. If you get a 100-degree day, you don't want your plants baking. So it regulates the soil temperature, makes it more even. The variation from day to night will be less. So that's the second big advantage. The third big advantage is that weeds grow just as fast as your vegetables in the summer, much faster actually. So nobody likes to pull weeds. It's just something I really dislike doing. So I mulch heavily all the time. No matter where I'm gardening, I'll have 3-4 inches of mulch. And basically, once you've mulched for a while, you just won't get any weeds. You'll get one here and one there, and weeding just doesn't become an issue. What's important in the summer to consider, though, is the heavy rains. A lot of the chunk mulches that you can buy, they will just float away in a heavy rain. So you want to move more toward the straw mulches. They're in general, they're better mulches anyway. Whether you use corn or wheat or pine, they provide good passage of air. They suppress the weeds, all right? They keep the water in, and wherever you can get them. You can buy them in any of the nursery centers. If you're in a community garden, in a park, I know in my gardens, we have some big pine trees in Laurel Park, so I go out there with my wheelbarrow and just gather up the pine needles. So you may find free mulch wherever you happen to garden. And especially for some of the crops we're going to talk about that grow on the ground. All right, if you're growing a vegetable on the ground, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail when we get to the specific vegetables, you don't want the vines or your fruits sitting in water for any prolonged period of time. So basically, you like to keep them off the ground, whether that's a soil ground, or it's sitting on a tarp, or it's grown into a path. You want to keep the vegetables and the vines. So you want to be mulching your vegetables, especially the vining crops, which many of the summer crops are. As they're growing, you want to be mulching them as they're growing. And now staking. Normally, when I garden, being a New Yorker, and everything in the big cities, is you grow up, you have tall buildings. To save space, I grow vertical. I grow everything up in cages. You'll see a couple of examples of that. Picture or two that Mindy has in there that we'll cover in a few minutes. But I grow a lot of my vegetables where I can up on cages, and I train them to grow vertically. That's okay in the winter where we don't get real bad storms, we don't get heavy winds. But in the summer, where we can get easily a 40 or 50 mile an hour wind and a heavy thunderstorm, if you've got this cage sitting up there 5 or 6 feet, you're going to have to brace this really strong to keep that thing from toppling over. So my preferred method for growing using any kind of support mechanism, and you don't have to, you can let the plant grow natural, is I would grow it vertically for a few feet, and then I would turn it and let it grow horizontal. And you don't have a problem for vegetables that are already growing on the ground, but for example, if I was growing tomatoes, all right, I would grow them up about 2 feet, and I would gently turn them, and a lot of commercial growers grow them horizontally, and I would grow the plant horizontally. All right, some kind of support structure that I would build. Again, this is really for summer only, just to withstand the storms. The other thing you want to think about, especially for some of the vegetables that may not like that real hot midday and afternoon sun. And there's a picture here to the right. And I don't know that I would recommend building something like this unless you're going to leave it here forever. This is a shade structure that one of our gardeners built, and he's got big metal posts, and he's got a lattice on the top, and you can see back in the background of the picture, I'm not even sure what he's growing back there, but as you can see, it's in the shade. Okay, and you can see the maybe sweet potatoes in the front getting more sun. So that's an option if you're trying to grow a vegetable that really would prefer a little shade in the afternoon. It's work to build one. So just throw this out as a possibility for trying to take advantage of a vegetable that might not like it too hot. And the last item, again, I'll emphasize again, is weeding. It's just so detrimental to growing vegetables. They can overtake your planting in the summer. They crowd out what you want to grow. They rob nutrients. They harbor host pests, whether it's insects, whether it's diseases. So again, if you mulch, you'll have to weed less, but you definitely want to weed. Okay, so in the next chart, I'm going to cover 4 vegetables. 2 of them I'll call transitional vegetables. And cucumber is one of them because it's a popular vegetable. And when I grow vegetables, I'm looking really for 2 things out of a vegetable. I want to be able to harvest it as quickly as possible. I want to be able to harvest it for a long time. And when I'm done harvesting, I still want to be able to enjoy the vegetable. So the cucumber meets all those requirements for me. It's relatively fast growing. I'm going to go to the next chart, Mindy. Okay, so it's not the easiest plant to grow in the summer. It will grow in the summer. And the reason I know this is because of the picture on the right. I took that picture before I left for my annual trek to New York. And that was taken around the middle of May. And that's our compost bin, which is totally unattended. You can see a bunch of weeds in there. There'd be something else in there to the left that's a little yellow. But the plant to the right is a cucumber plant. And how it got in there, someone just threw an overripe cucumber in there. And it sat there, and it probably rained a little bit, and one of the seeds germinated. And I just thought it was interesting that it was growing there, so I took the picture. When I got back in the beginning of October, that little plant, and you can't see it, but there's a chain link fence behind our compost bin that goes about 6 feet to the left and about 6 or 8 feet to the right. The cucumber plant had mostly died by the beginning of October, but the vines had completely gone 6 or 7 feet to the left, 6 or 7 feet to the right, and there was still 4 or 5 cucumbers. They were huge. They were about a foot, far beyond edible. But I took one home, and I just wanted to eat it for the fun of it. And it was not great tasting, but it was good tasting. So the reason I'm listing it is you can grow cucumbers in the summer. You would plant the seeds now up until the end of this month. And it's one of those plants where you can grow it any way you want. You can grow it on the ground. It's going to take up a fair amount of room. It doesn't have to grow on soil. Just the roots need to be in soil. If you have an area, if you're in a community garden and the plot next to you is covered, you can let it go across your neighbor's plot as long as you let them know. If you have an area at home, you can let this, it's a vine, and it's self-clinging, which means it'll grab onto anything very securely. So it can grow up another plant, it'll grow up anything. So once you get it established, assuming you don't have any problems with diseases, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, that's going to be the biggest problem with cucumbers is the diseases. If you have them, hopefully less so in the summer, as my little example in that picture showed. We have a very bad fungal disease called Downy Mildew, which hits cucumbers and everything in a family called cucurbit, which is a lot of what we want to grow in the summer anyway. But it hits cucumbers especially bad, squash, melons, cantaloupe, watermelons, very little. Bill's going to cover a vegetable that it doesn't bother. So there are a few that it doesn't hurt very much, but cucumbers are a disease that it does. So if you're going to grow it, you can grow it on the ground or a trellis. If you're growing it on the ground, you would do what we call hill planting, which is nothing more than a 1 or 2 square foot area You can either hill up the soil or dig a trench around it. And the purpose of that is to keep the roots from drowning. Again, depending on where you're gardening, whether you have standing water after a heavy rain, if you have no drainage problems, you don't really have to elevate the soil or dig a trench around it. But if you do have standing water, that's a good practice in a lot of these crops that we're recommending, that you make sure that the water drains from a heavy rain. If you're growing it in a hill, you would maybe plant 6 or 8 seeds in a 1-foot diameter circle, 3 or 4 inches apart. Once they come up, you'd thin it to 3 or 4 plants, and then just let them go. If you're growing on a trellis, you want the openings of the trellis to be about 4 inches square. The reason being, if you make the openings too small, the cucumbers get trapped in there. So half of it comes out one side, half of it comes out the other side. It's squeezed in the middle. You have to cut it in half to get it out. So you want to have enough room for it to fall through the trellis as it grabs onto the trellis to support itself. And you want to brace the trellis if you're growing it on a trellis for the summer storms. It can get quite heavy. I grow cucumbers in an earth box. And an earth box is, if you've never tried it, it's an excellent growing vehicle. And one cucumber plant growing in ideal conditions can produce 20 or 30 cucumbers. So you want to keep that in mind when you grow this plant. The variety, and there's probably a couple more. In fact, I quickly looked up a couple more for you. This is a market Morris variety I've been growing for a long time. It is somewhat resistant to Downy Mildew. A couple I found from some of the extensions, Dasher 2, Citadel, which is a more recent one. There are probably a couple of dozen varieties of cucumbers that are resistant to this fungal disease. And what I would recommend is when the plants are young, especially when they're young, because if you can keep the disease, if you do have the disease, you may not. But if you do, if you can keep the Downy Mildew from starting on a young plant, you're going to get a much better chance of getting a good crop of cucumbers. Copper is the preferred fungicide for controlling this disease. Copper soap is actually an organic fungicide. It's the least toxic of all of them. And the toxicity problem for the plant, and you always want to be careful when you spray. You don't want to be spraying in heavy winds or, if it's raining. You want to spray when it's calm, probably early in the morning. But for the plant, you would spray the copper about every 7 to 10 days. Follow the label. This is the least toxic for the plant. While copper, again, is one of those chemicals that the plant doesn't normally have a problem with. If you build up too much copper in the plant's going to start to show copper problems. So you use it sparingly, use it when the plant is young. If the plant is growing like crazy, not yet, Minnie, you don't really need it. You would harvest the fruits about 6 to 8 inches. If you really like pickling cucumbers, there are pickling varieties. I've tried them. They're not as heavy producers as the full size. So I make my pickles out of the full-size one. And this is one of the main reasons I grow cucumbers, because if you're going to grow a crop that's going to produce 50 to 100 cucumbers, there's no way you're going to be eating that many cucumbers unless you have a lot of friends and relatives. So what I basically do with about 80 to 90% of my cucumbers is I make pickles out of them. So long after the cucumbers are done, I'm enjoying my pickles. I just finished off my pickles from New York. And I'm going to take to New York about 15 or 20 quart jars of pickles I made from Florida. So this is an all year round, you can enjoy it crop, which is really why not only would I recommend it for the summer, but if it does well in the summer, it's going to do well in the fall also for you. You may have to rotate it if you do see the diseases started. Okay, so the cucumber, I'll call it a transitional crop because it does well in the warm weather. It will do okay in the hot weather. Watermelon does great in the hot weather. Again, this is a picture. I was absent from when this picture was taken. It was taken in the middle of July. What you see in that picture, that's all watermelon plants. And actually the blue tarp in the foreground of that picture, that's my tarp. And my neighbor, somewhere in the middle of that plot, way back in the background, are probably about 20 or 30 watermelon plants. There's way too many watermelon plants. Each plant is probably going to produce, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7. This is a variety called Sugar Baby, which is a midget. And I would recommend growing a midget because it's going to give you watermelons quicker. The other thing I would recommend is if you can stagger your crop. So I would plant maybe 2 hills of watermelons. Again, you know, put 6 seeds in each hill. Plant the hills 3 to 4 feet apart, and maybe plant the first hill now. And if you have the room, the second hill in about 2 weeks, so that you extend the crop, because this one you can't store. This one you're going to have to eat. And the same with all the vines. Fertilize everything before you plant it. 2 to 3 plants per hill. Mulch the hill. Once the plants are about 6 to 8 inches long, start to mulch out. Doesn't need any support. You can grow it on the ground. Water is needed. All right. Now, obviously, you'd have to find out where the plants were in that picture. Like the grower probably knows, but that would be actually a little difficult to get the water to the base of that plant. But you can see how dense it's grown. And they are relatively disease-free. Over the years at Laurel, at least, you know, for the past 10 years, I've seen at least 3 or 4 gardeners that garden in the summer actually use it as a ground cover. So even if you don't like watermelons, it's an excellent ground cover. And again, in the fall, you can chop it up and turn the leaves into the soil to enrich the soil. And the sugar babies should harvest, you should be able to harvest them in about 60 to 90 days from when the plants emerge. What you should see in the,
sorry, that's a sugar baby right there.
Yep. And that's probably ripe. There's a couple of more tests. If you just go back 1 chart for a second, Mindy, it'll be a light green when it's growing. As it starts to ripen, now light green will turn to the color that Mindy has shown on the next chart, and that's that dull green color. The other thing that's going to happen right around where the stem of the plant is, you can stay on your chart, Mindy. Okay. You can go to the next chart. Right around the little stem that comes off the vine, the tendrils, which are the little things it likes to grab onto, they'll start to turn from green to brown. And another tip that Bill gave me, if you turn it over, normally, since it's not getting sun, it'll be a very light color, like a very whitish type color. As that starts to yellow on the bottom, that's your 3rd sign. So the changing color from lighter green to dark green, the tendrils starting to turn brown around the plant itself, and the bottom of the plant starting to turn yellow, then you can pick it and hopefully enjoy your watermelon. Okay, this is another I'll call it it's a summer winter, it's a fall winter, it's a spring winter, and it hangs in there over the winter.
And then, yeah, and then Arnie, we're at 239.
Okay, okay, so I should probably wrap up in another 10 minutes. Does that sound good? Okay, so the picture on the right actually was from my garden, and then you can see an example of how I would grow my eggplant in the winter. In the summer, you can grow them, let them grow free, and I'll show you a picture on the next chart with growing free, but the plant that's all the way in the back of that, if you just stay in that chart one more second, Mindy, the plant that's all the way in the back of that picture is it produces an eggplant like Mindy's showing on the left. It's a traditional full-size 6 to 8 inch purple eggplant. It's a variety called Classic, if you can find it. The stores do have it. It's a very common variety. Bonnie Plants, which is one of the biggest providers to our nurseries and our big box stores, carries it. And I have 2 of them growing in my garden now. Actually, I closed my garden today for the summer because I'll be leaving in a couple of weeks. But my co-manager and neighbor asked me to leave 2 of those the way they are. And the way you see that picture is the way they are. So he's going to keep gardening it through the summer and until he gets tired of it. So it's a kind of vegetable where you may just get tired of it. And even it'll go through the summer and keep going through the fall. You can go to the next chart now, man. Thank you. Okay, so there's a picture that's from mid-July, and that gardener grew it on the edge. He covered his plot. I'm not sure whether his plot was on the left or the right, but he's kind of growing it on the edge of his plot. And there it's growing just freestanding. There are some low supports there, and you can grow it that way. The eggplant are very heavy. If you grow it that way, there could be 3-4 pounds each. They will fall to the ground. They'll weigh the stem down and they'll gently get to the ground. And again, you want to mulch it so you keep the fruit off the ground. You fertilize it before you plant it, fertilize it. It's a heavy feeder. You can ignore that iron. The fertilizer ban that we have here in Florida doesn't apply to vegetables. So you can fertilize through the summer. Again, Classic is my preferred variety. It'll outproduce Black Beauty probably 2 to 1. 60 to 90, about 80 days is about the average for the big eggplants. If you want to get eggplants earlier, Japanese eggplants, it's a purple eggplant that's 8 to 12 inches long and 1 to 2 inches in diameter. And I grow that also. The biggest advantage there, you're going to get it 20 to 30 days sooner than the standard variety. So if you want to get eggplants sooner and you want to try this variety, or you've tried Japanese eggplants, it's a very good frying eggplant. You won't find Ichabod in the stores. You can only grow it from seed that you'd have to order from seed manufacturers, but there are plenty of Japanese eggplant varieties that you can find in the stores. And again, if you're going to grow it on any type of trellis, it needs strong support, and it will go right through to the fall and keep on going. It almost turns into a tree. The eggplants that I've left, the stems have turned woody. They're not soft. They're more like a woody tree type shrub than a vegetable. And people have kept them going for a year and a half in our community gardens. Okay, so again, this is one of these that you can't miss. You plant this and it's going to grow. Very few diseases bother it. Not a lot of insects bother it. Caterpillars will chew the leaves, but it's a quick grower. So you won't normally have to do anything with this except just harvest it. Okay. Okay, this one again is a transitional vegetable. There's a picture again from the middle of July. That's probably a spring tomato plant that a gardener kept going. You can see there are tomatoes on it. There's one higher up that's starting to turn yellow. There's one lower down toward the left that's orange. But this plant really probably is not heat tolerant, and you'll get some nice green growth, but really not a lot of tomatoes. So these are tomatoes that probably formed probably in sometime now, and this is what it looked like in July. So if you want to try tomatoes, the most popular variety that you can find in a store, because it's too late to start these things from seed, is a cherry tomato, either sweet 100 or super sweet 100. If you can find it, is probably the most recommended variety, and that's what I would grow in the summer. It's earlier than the big tomatoes. If you're planting an 8 to 12 inch transplant, you should be able to get ripe tomatoes in about 2 months. So if you went out tomorrow and bought this and planted it, by the middle of August, by the middle of July, you'd be already harvesting cherry tomatoes. University of Florida has worked on raising the temperature at which they'll set fruit up so that these nighttime temperature in the 70s, mid to upper 70s we get, will allow the tomato to still set its fruit. If you can find them, a variety called yellow pear, heat wave 2, which is determinate, that means it's like a patio tomato. It's only going to grow 2 or 3 feet tall. It'll be very bush-like, produces a limited number of tomatoes. Solar Fire is another variety that will also produce fruit. It's indeterminate, which means it'll grow like a vine. Depending on how you want to grow it or train it, it could grow 10 or 15 feet with no problem. Again, ignore that note about the fertilizer ban. We're allowed to fertilize our vegetables. Tomatoes are another heavy feeder. If they're producing well and you don't have the diseases in the summer that we get the rest of the year, then you're gonna have a plant that's really gonna grow very, very quickly and very rapidly. So with tomatoes, probably of all of vegetables we grow, it's probably subject to the most problems. A lot of people can't grow tomatoes. Well, that's maybe not the right word. Give up on tomatoes, and I would say don't give up on them, because there's workarounds for every one of these problems. So they get a lot of diseases, a lot of common diseases that really like tomatoes, and some other plants, but mostly tomatoes. Fungal diseases, we have 2 down here in Florida. They're both bad diseases. One is called early blight. The other is called Septoria spot. Every tomato plant that I've ever grown since I've been growing tomatoes has died at some point from Septoria spot, whether it's up north, whether it's in Florida. So it's a very common disease. It's not a disease that you're going to be able to get rid of, but it is a disease you can plant around. Okay, so yeah, we'll show this one first, and then we'll go back to the other 2. The picture on the left is the early onset of Septoria spot. It's always going to start on the lower leaves of the plant, because the spores, just like a mushroom, they'll sit on the soil, they'll sit on the mulch, they'll sit on your clothes, they'll sit on your tools, they'll sit anywhere, and they'll survive for up to 2 years waiting for a host plant. So Rotation, if you can, is the best advice to minimize it. Sometimes it's hard to rotate in a small plot, but that's the start of early blight. I've never had a plant die from it. It actually grows faster than the early blight. It starts out looking like that, yellow leaves, and if you see on that middle yellow leaf, a little brown, kind of not circular, but sort of like a oval shaped, and it'll have a little brown dot in the center. That's classic early blight. And in about 2 weeks later than this picture, well, go back to the picture for a second, Minnie. That leaf will be dead. Now, the disease on the right almost doesn't look like you have a disease. But if you look closely on the leaves, you'll see little brown dots, like little shots, and they're very small. They may be a 32nd of an inch. That's the start of Septoria spot. It's a much more faster spreading disease than early blight, much more damaging to the plant, harder to control. And again, with both of these diseases, on a young plant, if you spray with a copper fungicide, you'll slow down the disease spread. And no matter where I'm growing my tomato plants, if I can get those plants big enough before the disease really takes hold, and I grow them away from the base of the plant, which means I'll grow them up and then I'll turn them away. So you just want to get the growing part of the plant as far away from the base of the plant. Eventually the disease will catch it, but not before you've gotten a lot of tomatoes. So, okay, we go to, now the disease on the left, unfortunately, that's a tough one. And tomatoes seem to be the most susceptible to this disease. It's called tomato yellow leaf curl virus. The bad news is once your tomato gets it, it's probably history, unless it's very large. About half my tomato plants got it this year, but they were so big it took 2 or 3 months before the virus really stopped the plant from producing tomatoes. If it catches the plant when the plant is young, the plant just stops growing. It's not going to produce any new tomatoes. It's not going to, the tomatoes that you have on there are not going to grow. You might as well pull a plant out. Okay, just, no, just, there you go. No, there you go. Okay.
And then, Arnie, we're getting positive feedback from folks that would like a tomato-only class. So some of the, and I know you've sent me some material for that.
No, so give me another 2 minutes.
Okay, and then we're going to switch over to Bill just to make sure we allow time for questions and answer at the end.
Okay, there's a picture on the right. It's about 4 or 5 years ago. I pulled out a real healthy tomato plant. And I'd grown it up 6 feet, grown it out, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet. And I couldn't even pull a root out. It was so rooted deeply. But this is what I found. And this is my first experience with root node nematodes. So on the left side of that plant, you see a rather normal looking root, the way a root should look, thin with a lot of hair roots. On the right-hand side, you see these huge bulges, right? That's a root node nematode that's been living in that plant for months and months. Now that plant was big enough so that I didn't even know I had them on the plant. So if you get your plant big enough before any of these either diseases, and that's actually a worm, a microscopic worm, a root node nematode. So if you get your plant healthy enough, big enough, before some of these either diseases or insects or animals start attacking your plant's just going to shake it off. Just like you would shake off, if you're healthy, if you would shake off a common cold. It'll just keep on growing. So again, timing is everything with all of these vegetables. Grow them big, grow them early. And with that, Bill, you got it.
I got to come off mute first. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Wegman. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to talk about 3 crops today that probably aren't grown too commonly in home gardens, but they grow very well in Florida. They do very well in the summer heat, and I generally grow them every summer because of their importance to me in my culture of my garden. They provide things for me that I look for in a summer crop. They provide good ground cover, help me suppress weeds in the areas that I can't grow other crops because it's too hot. They provide, probably more importantly, they provide green manure for me to use in my my planting beds and in my compost pile. And for those of you who don't know what green manure is, it's green material that can be worked into the soil to help enhance the characteristics of the soil and provide nutrients to the plants that are coming. And then I look for a crop that'll provide me something that stores pretty well that I can use in later seasons. So the three things I'm going to talk about are Seminal pumpkins, peanuts, and sweet potatoes. I'll talk about Seminal pumpkins first. These are they're basically open pollinated heirloom variety of winter squash, but they're native to Florida. The Seminole Indians grew them here for decades. They're a wonderful plant to grow because they produce these small yellow pumpkins that really taste a lot like a butternut squash, but they can be used in a lot of different ways. They keep well, they make good pies. Anywhere you would use a butternut, even just as a cook in an oven, and you can see they store really well. These were grown last summer, so you have a good idea of what you can do with them. And they taste just as good as they did the day I picked them, although when you grow this crop, you can pick them when they're small and when they're young, and they taste a lot like a zucchini or a summer squash. So you can kind of harvest some useful crops off the vines as they grow, and then let some of the fruits mature. And generally, when they start to turn from green or green striped to yellow, you pick them and then store them. But they grow in a variety of shapes. The vines need a lot of room to spread, but they're generally low maintenance. So they make a good ground cover. They shade out weeds. Very little weeding is needed. I think the best thing about them is they only grow well in a warm season. They need hot weather, so they like the hot weather. They will grow very fast when the temperatures get above 80. They need, like I said, they need room to spread. They're very resistant to diseases like downy and powdery mildew. They're just a really good choice for hot, humid areas, disease-prone areas. And then I compost, actually bury. I use a trench composting technique, and I actually bury the vines, leaves and everything below where I'm going to plant other crops in the winter. So the harvesting can happen anywhere from 60 days, like I said earlier. If you want to get a small zucchini-like squash, they'll actually look green. They'll be green and they'll have stripes. They won't have swelled into a pumpkin shape yet. They'll still be long. And then you can wait 100 days or so to get the larger squash just before you finish them off. They're related to calabaza, which is some of y'all might know is a fairly common. It's called a Cuban pumpkin in South Florida. It's they grow it as a commercial crop down there. It's used in a lot of Latin cuisine. So I don't know if you're interested. I have some links. Mindy, you can move on. We can go to sweet potatoes.
For the Seminole pumpkin, would you plant them as a starter plant, or would you plant them as direct seed? And do you use a mound like in a watermelon?
Yeah, you don't have to use a mound. Arnie's point about water is kind of important to pay attention to. I generally, what I do is I started my seeds in 3-4 inch pots, small pots, probably 4 weeks ago. And I just set the plants out. The little plants were probably 3-4 inches tall. I just set them out for this summer. And I mounded some of them up, but I have some raised beds that I don't even bother to mound them. The raised bed is high enough to keep them out of any heavy thunderstorm water. So I just go ahead and plant them. I also had some spaces in the community garden that aren't being renewed. So I went ahead and planted direct seed, some of those, because I know I'll have a little bit more time to harvest into August. Probably somebody won't sign up for that until September or October when they come back from up north. So I know I'll have time to let them spread and let them cover, and they'll help me keep the weeds down in there. So I went ahead and direct seeded some of those spaces. But so you could still plant them. Ideally, that you would have started the plants about a month ago. It really depends on how you cycle your crops in your garden, how big your garden is, how many beds you have, because I rotate things around. I won't plant Seminal Pumpkins in the same place I plant sweet potatoes, and I won't plant peanuts in the same place I plant the other three. I switch them around in the summertime where I'm planting them, you know, for various reasons. Mostly disease, to keep control of diseases, and nematodes to some degree. Although the composting techniques I use, the trench composting, I could give you some good links on how that benefits you with regard to nematode control. But so some of the stuff I'm doing with this growing biomass, if you will, or green manure in the summertime, is a technique I use a strategy I use to mitigate nematodes later on in the fall and winter crops. So it's kind of important for me to not only get something I can eat out of it and something that will store well from the summer, but also I get a large amount of biomass that I can use in my other gardening techniques. But you can ask questions. I can expound on that a little bit more later. I can give you links.
Yeah.
But sweet potatoes.
Yeah, and I'll email them. Some of the feedback from folks in the chat box is for the link, so I can send follow-up email with that.
Yeah. Sweet potatoes are native to North America. They're particularly Central America and Southern North America. So they're pretty much adapted to this area. They do well in the summertime. They actually won't grow very well in the wintertime. Some people try to grow them in the fall and the winter, and they wonder why they don't grow. They kind of go to sleep in the wintertime, which is there's an advantage to that, and I'll talk about that later. But they're in the morning glory finally. They do get flowers on them. They need about 11 hours of sunlight in order to flower, and that's one of the ways you can tell when they're ready to harvest. But and they come in all sorts of different colors. The picture you have here are some whites and some Beauregards, which is an orange variety that I grew last summer. I have some purples that I pulled out of the ground. They're smaller, but they're purple color that I pulled out of the ground when I was harvesting my slips to plant, because they will grow much slower in the wintertime, but when they start to take off and grow, they will develop and set tubers. So sometimes I get, particularly the purple varieties, I get tubers from the plants that I was overwintering to save slips. But anyway, I'll talk about the slips in a minute. It's a way of propagating the plant. So anyway, they come in yellow, orange, white, even purple varieties. They're very tolerant of hot Florida summers. They do very well in the heat. They love to grow and thrive when it's the hottest. They look the best when it's hot. They don't mind sandy soil, which is a good thing, because Florida sandy soils. They grow in pretty poor soil, really. I mean, they take the advantage of the best of what's available there, and they grow good. They do require a long growing season to get something decent out of the tubers, tuber size. They're not a quick crop. And I don't know if most people know this, but the leaves, the shoots and leaves, the young leaves are edible in your salads. So you get some leafy greens in the summertime to use in your salads. And they taste a little bit like spinach, kind of a little different, but they're a very good source of vitamin A and vitamin C. They're just a really tasty, good crop to grow to get some greens. And it does help the plant to some degree if you pinch off the apical bud or the main shoot, they'll branch. The side branches will branch out, and that keeps them from being so rangy. They won't end up as ranged so far away from where they're planted. They'll stay more in a bush area. So I kind of do that just to get something to eat, but also I do it to keep the plant under control. They have few natural enemies. Pesticides are rarely needed. I have seen whiteflies on them. So that's kind of an issue to think about, because if you worry about some of the diseases already talked about, like tomato yellow leaf curl, it's transmitted by whiteflies. So you kind of got to watch the plants and make sure that you're not developing a huge infestation of whiteflies that is going to carry over into the fall. So I kind of watch them for that. And the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is to keep your garden weeded as well as you can all year round, because they provide a host or a source for the whiteflies to persist, and then they can explode on the sweet potatoes, and then they hang around and they explode on your tomatoes in the fall. So you kind of watch that. That's just something to pay attention to. That's the only natural enemy I've seen. I don't spray mine. If I get a huge, I'm pretty much an organic gardener, so I generally don't spray anything. But if I get an infestation of whiteflies, you know, I might pull them early, so I have some fallow period before I plant my tomatoes and stuff. But like I said, they grow well in poor soils, and they make an excellent green manure crop. They produce so much foliage, and you think, oh, what am I going to do with all those vines? They're all over the place. How am I going to deal with that? Well, trust me, it's great fertilizer, and it really works well in a berry composting system. I don't know if you practice something called hugel culture or hill culture. It's another way to grow vegetables on top of a berry compost system. Or you just have a general composting system where you're looking for some good green material to mix with your browns and mix things up. It's excellent green material. It speeds up your compost pile, breaking down all the stuff that you put in there. They're really good composting material. And if you get whiteflies and you got to harvest early, in the compost pile. I guess I wanted to talk about how you propagate them. They're propagated from slips. A slip is a small plant. The tubers that are in the ground, well, if you don't pull them and you just harvest the green tops, they'll shoot up new shoots. So anyway, what I do is I harvest the main tubers, the larger ones, and I harvest all the green material to use in my composting system. But then there's always a lot of smaller tubers, a lot of ones that you probably wouldn't eat. And what I do is I take off an area side of the garden in the fall that I create a small hill, and I put all the small tubers in there. And then I put hay all over the top of it to protect them. And like I said, when it starts to turn cool, they'll slow down their growth. They won't grow very fast at all, but the tubers will stay alive in the ground, and the little shoots that come out of the tubers in the spring, late spring, when you're starting to think about planting these in the ground for your summer crop, you dig that hill up and you get out the small tubers that have sprouted, and the sprouts will have rooted all around, and you can separate them from the tuber, and then you end up with a slip. It's a long stem with several leaves that you can trim some of them back, and then you separate it from the tuber below where the roots are coming out of the stem, and then you plant those in the ground, and they'll grow new plants, new tubers, and then the whole thing starts over again. So I have several varieties that I normally recommend, Beauregard being the main one. You can usually find that in some of the garden centers. I've even seen it at Walmart. But once you buy them once, you can save them, and you can keep them going all year round, so you never have to buy more. And that's what I do. I have 3 or 4 varieties that I focus on that I keep alive from season to season. You want to do peanuts, Mindy? Move on, and then maybe we'll deal with questions. Okay, so another crop I like to do, this is real important to me for green manure too. The tops are excellent green manure. But I also grow them for the nuts, obviously, but that's somewhat important, but not the most important thing. They make a great ground cover. They're a legume, a part of the bean or pea family. So one of their characteristics that's really useful is they fix atmospheric nitrogen. into a molecular form that plants can use. So they require a lot less nitrogen fertilizer. You can leave it on that slide. They don't require any fertilizer, really. They'll grow in bad soil. They'll grow in sand. Yeah, I've grown these so many times and basically turned them in and improved the soil in my my beds that they really are not growing in sand anymore. They're growing in you know, composted humus. So they do well in either type of soil. They need a sunny area and the soil should be well drained. And the reason I say that is the nuts are not very tolerant of damp soil. The plant itself will grow like crazy and be very healthy and look great on top. But if the soil's too wet, the nuts can, the quality of the peanuts can degrade. So a light sandy soil is probably the best, which you probably have plenty of that. And like most vegetables, they prefer a little bit of composting material in the soil, breaking down to slightly lower the pH a little bit. But again, I grow them for the green manure. They add, when you mix them back into the soil and bury them, they'll add organic material to your sand. You don't have to water them. Most seasons, unless we don't have a very good rainy season, they're very drought tolerant. You don't have to water them too much. They sprawl out and cover a lot of area. They shade out weeds, so little weeding's required. They are very slow growing in the beginning when you plant the seeds. And I don't know if you know how you plant them, but if you've seen a peanut in the store, usually when you buy seed from a seed supplier, they'll send you the whole nut. The peanuts are in the shell still. And you can buy raw peanuts at Publix and do the same thing, but you shell them out very carefully so you don't break the nuts or damage the skin that's on the nut itself, the seed itself. And you plant those seeds that are inside the nut with the little pointy end down. That's where the embryo is. You plant it down if you can. It's really not that important, but they get a better start. You get a better germination if you do that. But then they'll grow, they'll sprout, and initially the first 3-4 weeks they'll grow very, very slow. You almost think nothing's going on, but what they're doing is they're developing their root system. And then all of a sudden, 3 or 4 weeks out, they'll take off, and the green tops will start to grow, and then they'll sprawl. So they'll spread out a foot in every direction from where you planted one. So I generally plant them 6 inches apart in a row. It rows 2 foot apart on a center, and they'll completely cover that area and shade out any weeds. You may have to weed until they get going, but then once they're going, you don't have to weed anything. They'll just cover an area. This is one crop I think it's important to kind of rotate around your beds because they somewhat, they don't really, I've never seen them really get attacked by nematodes, but they're not really good in terms of nematode control for later on down the road. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll plant mustard in the rows, in between the rows, just sow some mustard seed in there, let it grow. And then what I do is when I harvest the peanuts, I'll bury the mustard in the ground behind the peanuts. The mustard has some characteristics that help you control nematodes. That's pretty much it. That's why I have mustard and marigolds down there. Sometimes I'll plant them. They grow so slowly in the beginning, you can actually plant another crop in between them, and that crop will grow, fully develop, and then you can pull it, and they'll have filled in the area by then. It helps control weeds and do other things. But this picture here is an interesting picture because, well, it's my wife harvesting peanuts, so that's interesting for that. And she loves to do that. She'll pull the plants up and put them in a wheelbarrow and take them over to a picnic table and sit at the picnic table and just separate them from the plants. And you can see you'll get maybe, they develop these nodules, so they look like a string of pearls. They're perfectly round. If you went back to Arnie's picture and looked at what a root knot nematode does to a plant, it kind of gets inside the root and destroys the thing from the inside and provides an opening for all sorts of fungus and other things that attack the root system. They look really ugly when you pull them up. But when when peanuts get this bacteria growing on them, they get like a string of pearls effect on the outside of the roots. And that's the bacteria fixing nitrogen inside the roots. But anyway, that's, you see that happening, you know good things are going on in the soil.
Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate all your time. I'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody. And Arnie, I think you're on the hook for a tomato webinar sometime in your future.
No
I
problem.
keep you quite busy. Thank you.
No problem.
And Bill, I've got some more ideas for you too.
I'll bet.
Thank you guys.